Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Glassy. I'm an Associate Professor at CQ University in Townsville. And it's our distinct pleasure to invite you all to the 2021 Global Animal Disaster Management Conference. And today's session is on Veterinary Emergency Management Training and Practice, the critical components for effective response, by Dr. Rachel Westcott, who's the coordinator from SAVEM. Rachel's bio is available on our website under speakers, as well as her abstract. But before we start today, just some basic housekeeping. The Zoom chat has been disabled. So if you do have questions, please use the Q&A function. You can add questions to that at any time during Rachel's presentation, and she'll either address those as we go, or we'll address them towards the end of her session. When you leave today's session, you will be asked to complete a short online evaluation form, and we encourage you to do that. And just a reminder that the video recording is not available until we edit them, all our videos, and release them as part of the GADMAC Awards ceremony in July. So for most of you in Australia that are listening in from Australia, you'll hopefully all know Rachel Westcott's great work. And so it's my distinct pleasure to hand over to Rachel for her presentation today. Thanks for your time today, Rachel. Over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I do need to just mention first up that there are some images in this presentation that do contain images, graphic images of animals that are dead, that are injured, and they're pretty graphic. So I'll try and give you a heads up when that's coming on. But just to warn you for now that is actually something that will be coming up, and just to be aware of that. This is the response that we're still in. The Cherry Gardens fire began on the 24th of January 2021. This is taken from our shed where we have all our SAVEM vehicles stored. It was just over the hill. That pyrocumulonimbus cloud was probably the first we've seen locally in this state. And because this fire was only 2,700 hectares, with that amount of energy, we believe that in the particulate matter in that cloud actually does contain a lot of incinerated animals. So this is what that fire ground looks like now. That's actually one of the better bits of the fire ground. Most of it is just sticks sticking out of the grey ash earth. So we are actually still in that response. I have an operations team out on fire ground now. We're probably about to scale down next week, but it's been a very busy response. So I've been a bit distracted with that. So, veterinary emergency management training and practice. Fire grounds are very dangerous places. People can die or be injured long after the fire front has passed. So veterinary EM is no walk in the park. It's taxing emotionally, mentally, physically. It's a fabulous discipline, but it's not for everyone, and that's fine. But it's just, you do need to be aware that it is actually a very strenuous event. So I'll tell you a little bit about the background of SAVEM shortly, but the plan has been created to enable the veterinary community in South Australia to mount an effective response to an emergency incident involving all species of animals in accordance with the state's arrangements. So we are actually an all species response agency. We don't just work with wildlife, as some people do get the wrong impression with that. Many of our fires are wildlife centric, but we are an all species organisation. So to that end, we actually consider ourselves an emergency service organisation. We think, act and speak and train and behave in that context, not as a primary animal rescue organisation. Aligning with the emergency services is critical to be able to conduct active response. And we've been like that since our set. Is the nation leader in Australia in all species veterinary EM, because to date we're the first and only structured, dedicated emergency management agency of volunteer veterinarians with formal legislated place in state-legislated emergency management arrangements. So that's a key point of difference, that we are legislated into state arrangements and have a proven track record over 12 years with 17 deployments. So the fire services have got to know us, and they know that we use the same systems and speak their language, that we understand chain of command. We know how to behave on a fire ground, we know how to do as we're told on a fire ground, and most importantly, we're trained to stay safe. We have become, over the years, part of the emergency services vernacular. I can turn up to a control centre and be welcomed. Oh, Savem is here, excellent. So that's really become, we have become part of the furniture, so to speak. So effective veterinary response really can't be achieved just with an animal rescue mindset alone. Rightly or wrongly, you run the risk of being labelled one of those crazy bunny huggers. And first and foremost, you need to prove that you're not a crazy bunny hugger, who is more likely to be a hindrance than a help, maybe needing rescue, and going out and doing stupid things that can put people's life at risk and risk the lives of anybody who's going to rescue you. So it really is about emergency services and being part of that structure. Our volunteers are vets and nurses and others with relevant skills like IT and logistics, but we don't teach them that professional skill set. They bring that professional skill set with them. Our training is largely about emergency management because you won't learn that outside the EM sector. Fortunately, those skills are 100% translatable to everyday life. We do occasionally run training where we might talk about particular treatments for burns, etc. But that's not our primary thing. Our main training is in veterinary emergency management with a very strong emergency services skew. And some vets do have ideas that they might be able to do things just because they're a vet, but it's not the case. Firegrounds are big levelers.
Yeah.
You do need to be able to work in a response that doesn't necessarily, it's nothing like business as usual. It's nothing like a clinical business as usual. Doesn't mean your day job skills are going to necessarily...
Well, look, that's partly true. I'm not sure that it's correct to say that you need to be a score 8.
Jeremy, could you
I'm getting a lot of feedback here, sorry. I'm just going to keep going. So this is the Kangaroo Island fire.
I can explain all that. Where are you going from and going to?
This is the Kangaroo Island fire ground where we arrived on the 4th of January after that fire started on the 20th of December when we were on the Cuddly Creek fire ground. The fire ground was literally littered with bodies. It was horrific. And this is another one of the nasty slides coming up, which you may want to not look at if you're a bit sensitive like that, which is fine. But these koalas were in one of the hottest part of the fire ground. The fire was very fast as well as being very hot. And these animals would have been overcome with the radiant heat before the fire front probably even got to them. Unlike the current fire where we're working in, where all that energy was concentrated in a small area where left. So if you're a vet with experience of fire ground, you really need to aim to forge strong ties with the emergency services sector. Our reputation has been carefully built up over the 12 years we've been operating, and we expect our volunteers to continue to contribute to that reputation. And just like the volunteer fireys, you can't just jump on a fire truck, you can't just jump in and join us either. But people join us because they want to contribute to the greater good in society, and they're willing to come to training in peacetime, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So how did this happen and what can be helpful to you if you're looking at doing something in this space? So we began in February 2009 after Black Saturday, when I brought together a group of veterinarians in South Australia, and we looked at what arrangements were in place for animals in South Australia, found that they were really needed to be updated and reviewed. And I already had done some biosecurity SAEM training, and as a former police officer, had a bit of an idea of where we needed to go with this. So with that expectation that climate change, as we all know, is going to mean more frequent and severe extreme weather events, that black swan events should be expected, expect the unexpected. So with that in mind, we set about upgrading the arrangements in South Australia. So we worked through for about 15 months and put the plan up to the official legislative body, the State Response Advisory Group, written into the State Emergency Management Plan in 2010, became state winner of the Resilient Australia Award in 2012 for our first plan. And then in 2015, we were moved almost to tears when we saw ourselves on a roadside sign for the first time at the Samson Flat Fire in January 2015, which was a really lovely thing for that community to do for us. So I guess the take-home message here is that this doesn't happen overnight. It's a lot of time and effort to pull all this together. Government departments cannot do what we have done. Volunteers are needed to do this kind of thing. You do need, if you're a leader in this field, you do need to be prepared to make sacrifices because it takes a lot of time, and that means time away from work. But the social capital among our volunteers makes it all worthwhile. We have a fabulous group of people who work with us and have come to work with us over the years. This is Alpha Team at the Cuddly Creek Fire on the 2nd of December. 5,000 hectare fire, which we thought was pretty big until we got to Kangaroo Island at 200,000 hectares. And so your most important asset is the right people. The first grant in 2011 was to train people, and then we gradually built our asset base from there. In this photograph, you can see us at a Saving Level 1 workshop where we invited the police coordinator of emergency management and major events, Senior Sergeant Russell Dippy, to come and speak to us. And Russell does that from time to time, very supportive of Saving, updates us on various legislative changes, etc. So Russell's always very helpful to us. But our volunteers, once you put on that tabard or those red field, your day job disappears, and then you become part of the team. Our volunteers are improvisers and problem solvers. Don't try and replicate a veterinary clinic environment because firegrounds are nothing like business as usual. But you do need to have a can-do attitude, be a good team member, and be a problem solver. So one of my favourite slides is this one I spotted outside a local CFS station because I think it's improving now with the messaging we're getting out. But a couple of years ago, people would just think they can just rock up and jump on the bandwagon and join in. But training is, of course, critical, and that's mainly for human safety as well as the efficacy of the response. So our training is mandatory. There are no exceptions. Some people have experience in this sector, but we need to know the Saving training team, of which there are 6 of us, need to know that everybody has completed the same training so we can all speak about the same sorts of things. So the paramount culture of safety with human life is absolutely critical and absolutely paramount, and we won't compromise on that at all. People have to start with the online training modules, of which there are 10. And you can see those 10 modules which are on the Saving website. People work through those and answer fill in a quiz at the end of each module on a downloadable PDF fillable answer sheet, send that into the training coordinator, and from there they are eligible to go to a level 1 workshop. Not everybody who comes to level 1 is suitable, but we have the level 1 face-to-face because it allows us to assess potential volunteers during activities in the workshop setting, which was another reason why we wrote our online modules in such a detailed way, which we did during COVID, so that we could get all the theory and all those sorts of things that take time in shop and get that all online. Do much more activities during the level 1.
Rachel, we just had a little bit of delay with your video and audio. So if you can still hear us, what I would suggest if you stop your video, but just maintain the audio.
Not a substitute for exercising in training. They have to be tested, reviewed, improved as a continuous cycle. And of course, somewhere in that cycle, there'll be a response. So we have, we'll have a team on standby until we're briefed by the control agency, which is the Country Fire Service here for fire. We talk about fire a lot because it is the major hazard in South Australia. Wait until we have a briefing from the control agency. We'll then obtain mapping, their incident action plan. Access to the fireground will be according to the conditions, but we never ever self-activate, and we have zero tolerance of anybody who does that, and they certainly won't be asked to join a response again should anybody step out of line and do that. So we have documentation that begins with a response that logistics and planning manage, and that will be site induction, and people sign their form to say that they've been through site induction. We supply people with triplicate event logs. Our action plan will be ready in SMEAX format, situation, mission, execution, administration, command, communication and safety. That's it for a 24-hour period. We have animal call sheets so that everybody's recording the same information from callers from the public. Vehicle daily inspection means that we can identify readily anything that needs to be be restocked or anything like that with the vehicles. That can be equipment, or it might be just as simple as fuel. Sit reps are done every night so that we record all that data. And rostering can be a bit of a nightmare, but usually that's planning's job and they can have a bit of a headache with that. But the mantra is continuous improvement. Debriefing at the end of the day or the end of the shift, end of the response, it's important for team members to be able to tell their story. There are always lessons identified, and then we work through those with lessons learned during peacetime, because every fire is different, and this one that we're currently in response to is no exception. So new lessons to be learned every time with every event. So this is the inside of the Savem Field Hospital on Kangaroo Island. We use that there because of the size of the response and the number of animals affected. And we had Joint Task Force, RSPCA, Zoos SA, DEW, the local vets and us all sharing that facility, which is a very similar structure to what you would have seen in Central Park in New York for COVID. 6 by 9 metre inflatable hospital that goes up inside of half an hour. And we're very fortunate to have that unit and be able to share that on Kangaroo Island, even though it was being shared with a lot of people, which made procedures slightly tricky because other people hadn't trained to our processes, but we managed. This is the next step up. Maybe not that big, but this is the next step up that we're going to aim to acquire with some corporate support, we hope, over the next couple of years. That alongside the field hospital will mean that the people are looked after as well as the animals in the field hospital. So that will be equipped with incident management team, meeting room, bathroom, sleeping quarters, refrigerated pharmacy, satellite rooftop comms, and that will mean that we can manage fatigue and rest our volunteers very readily. That will enhance security on fireground and certainly communications. So that's where we're heading, because this stuff's only going to get bigger and bigger and worse and worse from a natural hazard point of view. Another sign, this response, we've moved up the ranks a bit. We're now ahead of SAPOL in the pecking order on the community signs, which is pretty nice. But seriously, it's lovely when we get acknowledgement like that from a community. New service incident management system. I did the AIMS course of two-day course a couple of months ago, and the system, of course, is the beauty of it is that it's flexible. It can be scaled up and down. It's very, very flexible for any, able to be applied to any kind of hazard. So we train to AIMS. We train to all hazards. There are 9 listed in the South Australian Emergency Management Plan: urban fires, rural fire, earthquake, flood, extreme weather, hazardous materials, human disease, and animal and plant disease, and terrorism. So you can see some different hazards in the pictures at the bottom of the screen there. One of those is from an oiled pelican from the Gulf of Mexico. One is obviously people rescuing their animals and leaving a flooded area. One on the left is of a little dog who was all day on a bridge in New Orleans in Hurricane Katrina, and that little dog was there all day. And while the Marines weren't supposed to pick up animals, it had been there all day. They had room, they picked it up, and it became the mascot for that particular air wing. Dynamic risk assessment, of course, because there are a number of things on fire grounds that are major hazards, things that can kill you other than the fire. And unless people are trained to this and know how to assess the fire ground and know how to practice dynamic risk assessment, serious things can go wrong. So falling trees are probably our major hazard, and probably the major hazard for anybody working on a fire ground. Very real hazard, and we work closely with the arborists and the CFS so that we know which areas can or can't be explored according to the trees, whether they've been assessed or not. This is a beauty. This is in WA in 2015, where one of those huge trees down in the southwest of WA came down behind the cab of the fire truck. But it can happen. It can happen very unexpectedly. White ash, of course, a crust of white ash can cover a crater where there have been burning roots underground. They can measure hundreds or even thousands of degrees, and people have lost limbs and had very serious burns and injuries by stepping into a crater covered by white ash that looks solid, but of course is anything but. Building hazards. The area through much of fire-prone Southern Australia will have asbestos. So asbestos is, of course, a hazard that we need to respect that signage is there, and don't enter without or otherwise of the relevant authorities. Other hazards, of course, are gas cylinders, ammunition, other explosive materials which may be held on farms, and chemicals. All that needs to be very much aware of. So in summary, First, critical for agencies to embed themselves with the emergency services. Need to earn that trust and respect and build credibility. Aim to become a formal part of your state's emergency management arrangements, and only in building that relationship and really gaining that trust and credibility can things really progress. So going into a response with only, we're here to rescue the animals mindset is dangerous and won't achieve access to incident ground. Once you prove yourselves as being able and capable of doing the right thing in line with the emergency services, that's a different story. So an emergency management approach and emergency services alignment will make all the difference. And that's it, folks.
That is brilliant. Thanks, Rachel. Lots of great points that have made there, and I wholeheartedly support them. So yeah, we've got a few questions that have come in. One is around how do you tie in with the PERSA vet response?
Yes, so primary industries are what's called the hazard leader for, under the State Emergency Management Plan, there are a series of, the next layer down is functional support groups, and primary industries lead the agriculture and animal services functional support group. Their primary role is assessment and treatment of livestock and support for the primary producers. So, we have, we can assist them if required, but they usually do an excellent job with their livestock response. And sometimes if it's a big livestock response, we'll go and do the little small holdings where they've got 2 or 3 or 4 livestock animals, and we can do that for them while they're concentrating on the big things. Reporting goes up through primary industries, back up through to back up the chain. And that usually works pretty well with our sit reps every day, make sure that all that data is passed on. So, the field teams from primary industries do some great work, of which you've had Jeremy's presentation earlier, and we're always happy to say hello to Jeremy on Fireground.
So how many members do you have, and what percentage would be registered veterinarians?
We've at this stage, this response, we've had about 40 people rostered on over 3.5 weeks. Probably about half are registered veterinarians. Because a veterinarian or clinical divisions, but a veterinarian, the teams don't have to be all vets. They can be, in fact, it's important that we have other people with team leadership skills and things like that.
Absolutely. And what do these vets do with their practices if they're away? How does that work? Obviously, usually vets are quite busy people.
If you're like me and you're a sole practitioner, you just have to have very understanding clients, which I'm fortunate to have. Other people in larger practices and multi-vet practices will either swap shifts, and they'll have somebody who can't join the response for whatever reason, or they may not wish to, so they might be doing other things. They can swap shifts and cover for them. That's often the case. And or just days off. If people have got a roster that's accommodating for days off, we can do that. We've usually found that works pretty well, really. We've never really had a problem staffing that, but just being mindful of fatigue management is the main thing. So we make sure that people do have enough time to, once they've been out on response for a couple of days, they've got a couple of days before they actually have to go back to their day jobs.
Absolutely. And how do you manage veterinary insurance? Who would carry any sort of liability?
If we're activated under state arrangements, we're covered by state arrangements, and we don't self-activate. So we are always covered by the Act, by the Emergency Management Act. We do have our own volunteer veterinary insurance as well, because that might be necessary for things when we go and do community events, for instance. That's not an emergency, but we might go out and take some equipment and put up a field hospital and do a demonstration to a community group. So we have our own volunteer insurance as well with a private company.
Absolutely, it sounds fantastic. And what about before the event? You mentioned about training, but do you do any disaster risk reduction activities as part of your approach?
Preparedness is always a message that we try and join in and to reinforce what the CFS are always putting out there. Disaster risk reduction has really certainly come a lot from an animal owner's point of view. It's come quite a long way with animal owners becoming more understanding that they are responsible for their animals as well. So we try and promote that message, try and make it easy for people to do the right thing. As you probably know, my PhD had a lot of DRR stuff in it, and a lot of that is translatable because it was a holistic approach where the things that I've put forward apply to people, but it also applies to their whole their whole little social microclimate. So their animals, their workplace, their schools, all those kinds of things. So yes, we do. Preparedness isn't our main gig, but we certainly back in the CFS as much as possible on those messages.
And how do you get on with peer assistance or mental health support for your team? What's the overall strategy
very
there?
good question. We do have access to the government or the primary industry's employee assistance programs. So that's made available to us after a response or during a response, so that if people are traumatised by the pretty horrid things that we see that can't be unseen or unheard, then they certainly have access to support.
Brilliant. And what about, just bring up another question here. And how do you track animals that you've assisted in terms of where they go to or whether they've been euthanized? How do you manage the statistics of your operations?
Yep, so all that documentation happens either in the triplicate logbook or on the animal call sheet. At the end of the day, at the end of the shift, the animal call sheets, we have a section in that sheet where the outcome is recorded. So animals, where they go, they'll either go to, and the options are usually the animal's fine, it can be left in situ. The animal's fine, but it's in an area and needs to be relocated. The animal has minor injuries, needs initial veterinary first aid, and then can go to a competent, experienced carer. Only it's competent, experienced carers. If the animal's worse, it needs to go into veterinary hospital for treatment for a little while. That can happen with either local practices or we send animals also to Cleveland Wildlife Park in the Adelaide Hills, where they have very impressive expertise in managing wildlife and injuries. So we try and get them out of fireground as soon as possible because it's a stressful environment. It's a noisy, dirty, stressful, hot environment. So we'll get them out as soon as possible. Tracking, on Kangaroo Island, we microchipped animals as well. There have been some animals have fallen through the gaps last summer, which is something that we're working with DEW to address, that doesn't happen again. And the permit system, which is not my problem, it's DEW's problem, has been reviewed as well. So, but we record, certainly while the animal's in our care, we'll record what happens to it, where it goes, and hopefully get some back to, and you know, it's really ideal if the person who brought the animal into care gets to release it as well.
Absolutely. Now, I think that's not an issue. Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm just working through the questions here, Rachel. Lots of really good interest. Now, what do you do for personal protective equipment in terms of, do you have rural fire certified equipment and helmets, or what sort of PPE do you require?
Yeah,
do you
sure.
do you also require your people to have those public safety competencies in wildfire awareness?
They don't need the public safety competency signed off, but they do need to have, we supply our red field overalls. They have to have their own, I mean, these days, in days of COVID, people really do need to have their own helmets to Australian standard, their own fire boots and their own gloves and goggles. We used to supply a lot of that equipment except for boots because that's a very personal thing. But because of since COVID times, we can only, I mean, overalls can be laundered, so that's fine. Yeah. But helmets, goggles, masks, gloves, they have to be part of the volunteers' own kit.
Oh, right.
But we have had some grants where we've been able to purchase those items and give them to people.
Right. And is that rural fire PPE, or is it just standard, you know, bump hats and sort of general...
It's become a bit of a mixture, but it's generally we buy from a fire and rescue outlet. Yes.
Fantastic. And what about funding? How do you get funding for your programs, activities, response vehicles, things like that?
Yep, we're funded. We're all volunteers, and we have so nobody is paid, but we have been funded by government grants, by philanthropic donations and grants, some corporate grants as well. So it's all competitive grants mostly. During a big response like last summer, there were some donations from members of the public, which were just freely given. But we don't go out and do GoFundMe or anything like that. If people support us, they support us from completely unsolicited. But the main things, the vehicles, the field hospital, all those sorts of things are either government, corporate or philanthropic grants and donations.
Fantastic. And in terms of your after action reports, you mentioned sort of those. Do you publish those, and do they include statistics on animals dead or rescued, etc.?
We collect all that information. We're fortunate to have one of our vets as being extremely interested in data gathering and statistics, and she generally manages that. And then depending on the response, if it's a wildlife response, all that data goes to DEW, the Department of Environment and Water, which is what we're doing now. So we'll collate it at the end of the response. It does go in the sit reps daily, but that's sort of just like a snapshot of that day. So we do need to collate that into the bigger picture. And that goes to DEW, or anything else. It just does go up the chain and will be recorded by primary industries as to what activities were done. And then generally that gets
are those and do they create after action reports which are shareable? I mean, sometimes there's little point having a lessons learnt report if it's not shared for the wider community.
Yeah, well, we certainly our debriefs. We gather all that information in our debriefs and after action reviews. What happens to the data higher up the chain? I probably can't answer that.
Brilliant. What if you have down here? And what software do you use to manage your rostering and staff scheduling?
That's been one that we've just started this response for the first time. It's one called Need to Meet. It's pretty cost effective, and it's had some teething problems because we were just finding that just using email was just too difficult to keep track of everybody's whereabouts, and people were it was too easy to miss things. So Need to Meet, I'm sure it's just our planning officer is managing all of that, but I think if people just Google Need to Meet and have a look at that, I find it might be helpful.
Great. And look, I think we'll finish off with one last question. You've taken a great list of questions there. The last one is, are you going to be operating outside of South Australia?
No, not currently, because Australia being an 8 jurisdiction country makes that very, very difficult.
Excellent. Look, I think that's been a fantastic presentation, and there are some really significant lessons for anyone that's interested in this kind of work. And you've got to put in the hard work like you have, Rachel. And I think you've really encapsulated if people want to do this kind of activity, these are the expectations. And my hat goes off for you that you've set a really high bar, and that's the bar if people want to join the game. So congratulations on all the work that you have done over the last decade plus on this kind of work. And I'm glad that you've got such a credible and professional response, which you and your volunteers should be very proud of. So any final comments, Rachel, before we bid everyone farewell?
No, thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of this with you, and I'll be waiting for my sched call from my team, which I've told them to call in after this presentation.
Well planned. Well, look, Dr. Rachel Westcott, thank you very much for joining us here at GADMAC, and we wish you all the very best for your current and future responses, and we look forward to having you back at another time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.